The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
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 Liberty. Liberty.
Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner,
a production of LibertyNation.com.
Cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Is America really stronger than ever? Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. President Trump claimed in a triumphant State of the Union address this week, which serves as essentially the start of his re-election campaign, that America is stronger than ever. We will evaluate that claim and offer up the Democrats' response in their week straight right out of hell. Are things as rosy for the president and as bleak for his opponents as they now appear? We'll bring on LibertyNation.com's outspoken political columnist Joe Schaeffer for analysis and our legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza for Talkin' Liberty. And we'll pay tribute to a genuine legend fighting for his life.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We commence the proceedings with our signature segment, Say What, where we roll out a virtual assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. From the moment Donald Trump took the oath of office 3 years ago, the public face of the Democratic Party has been two things: Trump hatred and socialism, a toxic mix of doom and gloom that had them looking like petulant children who screamed and stomped their feet because they lost to Trump and refused to go to their rooms. But as if that wasn't bad enough, this week they added a third element to that public face: gross incompetence. With the nation watching the curtain rise in Iowa on the opening act of the Democrats' lone attempt to remove President Trump the old-fashioned way through the ballot box, a party already bracing for final impact on its failed foray into impeachment could not have experienced a cold sweat nightmare any worse than the embarrassment of a process that failed to even render any results before the world moved on and made fun of the Democrats. The quality control offered as the pathetic excuse, which left people hanging for hours on end and then days on end, was amateur hour on parade on the world stage. 5 candidates all delivered their pre-written victory speeches in a results-free environment. It was bizarro world. Trump must have been doubled over laughing. But that was just part one of the trifecta. The very next day, Trump delivered a triumphant State of the Union to an audience of millions, which doubled as an extremely effective campaign speech, enumerating one impressive fact after another on the state of the economy and jobs and income. Here's his baseline message and a couple of points he made that were key but flew largely under the radar.
If we hadn't reversed the failed economic policies of the previous administration, the world would not now be witnessing this great economic success. Under the last administration, more than 10 million people were added to the food stamp rolls. Under my administration, 7 million Americans have come off food stamps and 10 million people have been lifted off of welfare. After decades of flat and falling incomes, wages are rising fast, and wonderfully, they are rising fastest for low-income workers who have seen a 16% pay increase since my election. This is a blue-collar boom.
That food stamp number is like a reverse indicator of the state of the economy. And rising wages among the working and middle classes faster than rich people, that'll be a central message of the Trump campaign. Remember that phrase, blue-collar boom. You will likely be hearing it a lot. Now, completing the trifecta that started on Monday and concluded Wednesday was the acquittal of President Trump, right after Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell offered up perhaps the best speech he's ever given, laying waste to the Democrats' scorched earth crusade to reverse the will of the American people.
We will reject this incoherent case that comes nowhere near justifying the first presidential removal in history. Leaders in the opposite party increasingly argue that if our institutions don't produce the outcomes they like, our institutions themselves must be broken. Within months, Secretary Clinton was suggesting her defeat was invalid. She called our president illegitimate. And members of Congress have used similar rhetoric. A disinformation campaign, weakening confidence in our democracy. Remember what Chairman Schaeffer said here on the floor. If the American people re-elect President Trump this November, that election will be presumptively invalid as well.
As soon as that speech ended, every Democrat voted to convict and every Republican, except one, voted to acquit, providing the long-expected outcome, 19 votes short of conviction, not close. But the one Republican who did vote to remove Trump was the man who failed to do what Trump did and has been on a rampage about it. Mitt Romney, saying God made him do it.
The allegations made in the articles of impeachment are very serious. As a senator juror, I swore an oath before God to exercise impartial justice. I am profoundly religious.
Stop the tape. Let's briefly deconstruct that statement. I am profoundly religious. As a conservative Christian in an evangelical church, a guy who's been an elder and taught adult Sunday school, I can tell you that no one of deep faith that I've ever met describes themselves as religious. Why? Because Christianity teaches that Jesus is God's way to man. Religion is man's way to God. Faith is Jesus. Religion is the Pharisees. So when I hear Mitt Romney put his decision off on God because he's profoundly religious, it just deepens the skepticism about his true motives in all this. Romney continued.
It was a flagrant assault on our electoral rights, our national security, and our fundamental values. Corrupting an election to keep oneself in office is perhaps the most abusive and destructive violation of one's oath of office that I can imagine.
Right. Let's just give you a final bottom line summary of what Romney and the Democrats believe. That we should kick this president out of office 9 months before a presidential election for delaying aid to a country for a couple of weeks that had been denied to that country for 8 years by the previous president, to help a country defend itself against the people the left still claims turned Trump into a Manchurian candidate, the Russians, turning logic on its head, and requesting an investigation, which was never provided, on Joe Biden firing the prosecutor investigating the company that paid his son $3.5 million over 18 months for nothing other than influence in the corridors of power. But the Democrats used unadulterated deception, or call it the big lie, to try and convince the American people that Trump was an out-of-control dictator, and it was repeated one last time by Alabama Democratic Senator Doug Jones, who started with an old political standby trying to invoke sympathy for a vote that he knows will almost certainly result in his defeat for re-election.
Throughout the impeachment trial, I couldn't help but think of my father. As many of you know, I lost my dad over the holiday recess. My dad was a great man, a loving husband, father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, who did his best to instill in me the values of right and wrong. Throughout the trial, one piece of evidence continued to stand out for me. It was the president's statement that under the Constitution, we have Article 2 and I can do anything I want. That seems to capture this president's belief about the presidency, that he has unbridled power, unchecked by Congress or the judiciary or anyone else.
So there's the tactics of politicians and the central lie of the Democrats. Invoke sympathy. And then you say Trump claims he can do anything he wants. Trump said that specifically and only about his right to fire James Comey or Robert Mueller or anyone else in the executive branch that he runs. He did not say in a vacuum that he can do anything he wants. But then he never said white supremacists in Charlottesville were fine people, but the left perpetrated that big lie with their cheerleaders in the media as well. Consider the sad spectacle of their presidential race. It's the killer bees, Biden, at least for now, Buttigieg, and Bernie. Bernie, who may take control of this race, but the establishment of the Democratic National Committee has taken steps to kneecap Bernie again by changing the rules to allow the billionaire Mike, don't call me Michael, Bloomberg, into the debate. And if you think Bernie's people are going to sit still for it, listen to the most famous of Bernie bros, a guy who tells it like it is, a favorite on our show, Michael Moore, go postal on Bloomberg.
He doesn't have to show he has any support amongst the American people. He can just buy his way onto the debate stage. And I got to tell you what's so disgusting about this. The DNC will not allow Cory Booker on that stage, will not allow Julian Castro on that stage, but they're going to allow Mike Bloomberg on the stage because he's got $1 billion.
And you know what? He's absolutely right. The question now is not whether this soulless, technocratic, control freak billionaire can buy all the airtime and staff he wants and buy his way into the debates, but whether he can actually buy his way to the nomination and into the White House. We'll talk over the sorry state of the Democrats and their presidential contenders with LibertyNation.com political columnist Joe Schaeffer a bit later in the show. But first, we'll take a breath and come back with a tribute to a true legend fighting for his life.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Where can you find honest political commentary with sobering analysis, accountability, deconstructing threats to our liberty, and boldly reporting the truth? Subscribe to the LibertyNation.com YouTube channel, where facts matter.
We believe that all men are entitled to blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
It's very hard for me not to get emotional about what we learned this week from a legend, a giant, a towering figure, all of that. The voice, the indispensable man of the conservative movement. Shows like this, Liberty Nation Radio, wouldn't even exist were it not for the pioneer of conservative talk radio, the man from Missouri who rose to genuine greatness. He single-handedly created and dominated an industry that now stands as a staple of the conservative movement and was stunningly awarded the highest civilian honor, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, by the President of the State of the Union address this week. Just how significant has Rush Limbaugh been? Let me say this personally as the host of this show for 8 years now. When I listen to him, my challenge is to not simply repeat or regurgitate here what he said, because it's always just about impossible to top. But the alternative is to not listen to him, which is not an alternative. So I attack many of the same issues from a slightly or drastically different angle. But make no mistake, Rush Limbaugh is the North Star, or as my friend Brent Bozell called him this week, True North, as both a conservative and a radio host, the standard against which all of us are judged as conservatives and as talk show hosts. That's some insight into the mind of a talk host, or at least this talk host. But on a broader scale, I will argue, as Brent Bozell did this week, that the conservative movement itself, writ large, would have shriveled up and died had Rush Limbaugh not been there to pick up the mantle from Ronald Reagan, Ronaldus Magnus, as he calls him, in 1988, the year his show began. The Reagan Revolution at that point was complete, but ready to be deconstructed by the kinder, gentler George H.W. Bush, who then gave way to Bill Clinton. Rush was the one who kept the fire burning, minded the store, just as William F. Buckley had done in the early days before Reagan, when Reagan was just a distant hope. I will also say, without reservation, that were it not for Rush Limbaugh, Donald Trump would not be president. Rush was the one who identified early on the unique opportunity for real major reform represented by this man who defied the longest of odds and made it all the way to the White House. Conversely, if Rush had sent forth the word to his 20 million plus listeners, like so many of the other conservative talk show hosts, that Trump was not a real conservative and should be viewed with, at best, deep suspicion, Hillary Clinton would be president today. That is the influence, the power, the respect this man has commanded for over 3 decades, and why he's been for many years the most reviled and feared man on the left, because he pulls no punches in calling them out with brutal honesty and humor to beat the band. No one can replace him any more than anyone could replace Bill Buckley, Ronald Reagan, or Donald Trump. Relentless, unswerving, uncompromising, the very qualities in Rush that Rush saw in Donald Trump. Rush will benefit from prayer warriors far and wide, millions of people who never miss his daily cleansing of their political souls, praying for his return to health. May he recover and stay with us, if only for the sake of we who are so deeply saddened by news of his grave health, stage 4 cancer. But at worst, may he at least live to see the dawn on November 3rd, 2020, because Rush just may come to feel that once Donald Trump is reelected, his work will be done. We'll be back.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Far more important than my political future and far more important than yours, the well-being of our country.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Republicans hit the trifecta in both expected and unexpected ways this week. Monday, the Democrats demonstrated that they can't even perform the most basic of functions in a democracy, counting votes. Tuesday, President Trump delivered a triumphant State of the Union speech and then was acquitted in the Senate impeachment trial on Wednesday. All of this as his approval ratings reached the highest point of his presidency as the Democrats completed their doomed effort to deny voters even the chance to vote for or against him in November. Joining us to sort through the Democrats' wreckage and a very good week for the president is Liberty Nation's outspoken political columnist, Joe Schaeffer. Hello, Joe.
Hello, Tim. Thanks for having me.
Well, always a pleasure. So, trying to sort all of this out, I'd have to say that Joe Biden had probably the worst week of any candidate and was probably saved by the vote counting debacle because that sucked up all the media oxygen. But he looks, Joe, as far behind in New Hampshire as he finished in Iowa, where he came in a dismal fourth place. It could even be fifth by the time all the votes are counted. His demise always seemed inevitable, but is it now imminent?
I don't think it is imminent because of what happened with Iowa, with the fiasco. It's actually the worst thing for the Democrats. The best thing would be to get rid of this guy as soon as possible. Now he gets to go on. He goes on to New Hampshire, and if he's not going to win, Bernie Sanders is going to crush him there. But if he's deluded enough to keep going on, and he may win a couple primaries down the road, and then nothing becomes settled, which is the worst thing for the Democrats to happen. So for Biden, yes, this was a horrible week, but because of the chaos with Iowa, he kind of gets away with it more than he should, and that is really bad for this whole process for the Democrats.
Right, but he'll have his day of reckoning up in New Hampshire, and assuming they can count the votes, which is a pretty safe bet, I think at this point. They've been doing it for a long time, and it's run by the state rather than the Democratic Party. He's not going to last much longer if he gets a similar result in New Hampshire, is he?
I think that the dual punch of Iowa and New Hampshire would have hurt him more. He can downplay New Hampshire and he can say, hey, Iowa, we don't know what happened. And quite frankly, that is true. So I think, no, he's deluded. He's been deluded all along. He thought he could just throw his hat in the ring and claim the nomination. And that most of us knew that wasn't going to happen. So I think his delusion is going to continue beyond New Hampshire, and I think he's going to stay in this a lot longer than he would have if Iowa had forcefully rejected him, and then New Hampshire had.
Well, you and many other people have questioned, by the very nature of the delays and the incompetence and everything, and the crashing of this app, that the results in Iowa are not really legitimate. Is there reason to think that we really can't trust the numbers that have ultimately come out of Iowa?
I think there is reason for that. What I find more interesting is, again, the Democrats have put themselves in this situation where everyone should suspect that. So, I mean, we can't count on these people at all. They can't even count votes in an Iowa caucus. So what this means moving forward, I think it's a terrible look. I thought Pete Buttigieg, it was horrible for him because now he looks like, even if it's not true, he looks like he was in on something being orchestrated. That's going to hurt him moving forward. You had 5 people declaring victory after this, before they even knew the results. It really doesn't matter if they eventually succeed in giving us some real numbers that we can count on or not. No one is saying that any of this smells right moving forward. And quite frankly, that's what we've all felt about the Democrats throughout 2019. None of this has ever felt right. Right.
It's absolutely true. And yet you might say, Joe, that the Iowa caucus results with the 5 competing quasi-victory speeches is kind of perfect for the Democratic Party. It's sort of like everyone got a trophy.
Yeah, that's it goes with their whole emotional outlook on things, I guess, but it makes them look so small in the eyes of the American people. And this furthers the internal divisions in this party. The Bernie bros are mad at the establishment. Buttigieg has now established himself as he wants to take up the mantle from the fallen Biden. He's all in on establishment now. I think it's a mistake on his part, but this is what he's done with this whole shadowy dealings in Iowa. So I think the big thing coming out of Iowa is the stark divisions between the progressives and they call themselves moderates. I call them establishment. I think it's going to be more fiery moving on, and that's going to be a disaster for the Democrats.
Now, as you discussed, best we can tell from the data we've been fed from Iowa is that the big winner, whether he actually finishes first or not, and the margin is still razor thin, was Mayor Pete, who's also looking strong in New Hampshire. Now, Joe, we're talking about a 37-year-old gay small-town mayor, and then a self-proclaimed socialist right there with him at the top. There's no question that Mayor Pete has punched way above his weight class, coming out of nowhere to be a factor. To even be a factor in the Democratic primary is really a remarkable thing. But all the talk after Iowa, other than the mind-bending incompetence, is that the real winner this week was Michael Bloomberg, an object in the rearview mirror that's closer than he appears. I think we can agree, Joe, that he's competent. And with an unlimited budget, he's worth like $50 billion. Is he now poised to drive home a credible case for his candidacy starting Super Tuesday, March 3rd?
Well, it's a good situation for him considering he sat out Iowa and Iowa turned into chaos. It's about his best, the way things could go. He's still not likable. That's the big thing. You can have all the money. You can have the incompetent rivals, which he has. He has a lot of things going for him, but at the end of the day, this is not a man who is liked by Democratic voters. He'll get a certain amount of the urbanite type vote, but progressives don't trust him for a lot of the things he did with in New York with the criminal justice reform and all that, which is a big issue for them. And anyone who doesn't care about urban issues, any Democrat voter who doesn't live in a city, there's no reason to vote for this guy. He's completely focused on his New York City worldview. I don't think it's enough to even win a Democratic primary, especially when the guy is so unlikable personally.
Well, we will soon find out whether the concept of a soulless technocrat, former Republican mayor of a huge city in the East Coast can actually get over on a party that's made it a point to demonize millionaires virtually throughout their process. Joe, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And you'll be back with us many times before Election Day, November 3rd. Quick break, and then we're back with a tribute to a legend. Quick break, and then we're back with Talkin' Liberty.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And we have now reached the impeachment-free zone of Liberty Nation Radio. It's when we welcome in our regular contributor, constitutional lawyer, and, of course, LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, Scott Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Tim. Thank you.
New York regulators have issued a surprising ban on charging renters brokers' fees. Now, this is a bit complicated, so simplify it for us.
It's a really surprising story, Tim. Consequential for an entire segment of an important industry in New York. For people who don't know, New York City real estate operates a bit differently than I think anywhere else in the country for a lot of the apartments. And what happens is the apartment owners themselves don't often seek or allow tenants to deal with them directly. And what happens instead is the people who want an apartment go to an independent broker. Much like if you wanted to buy a house, you would go to a real estate agent. You wouldn't necessarily go to a homeowner to try to buy a house directly from them. And that's how these apartment listings are done. The brokers sort of pre-qualify the applicants, and they take typically 1 month's rent as their fee for doing this, then placing that applicant with the property. Well, Tim, in June of last year, the state passed some laws that basically changed the regulations that strengthened existing rent controls. But they didn't authorize the elimination of that service. But, Tim, the New York Department of State the rule makers. So we've got the lawmakers and the rule makers, right? One of the things we've talked about on the show a bunch of times is how Donald Trump is remaking the United States of America because of what he's done with the Code of Federal Regulations and the executive's ability to craft that or to eliminate those regulations. Well, there's similar exec regulations like that at the state level. And that's what we have here. New York's Department of State, a state-level rulemaking body, has taken those June of 2019 passed laws and said, well, here's what we're reading into that law. Here's what we've decided that law means. It means that you cannot be a real estate broker for rental property in New York because that fee is disallowed. So how are they going to get paid? Well, you've just eliminated the whole marketplace. It's quite shocking. There are many people who make their living doing this work, and many apartment people who, use this service. By the way, plenty of New Yorkers loathe this service, and that's, I think, why it's been eliminated, because they see it as, feeding off people who are in need of an apartment or whatever. But it's quite shocking.
Now, if you, dear listener, thought that we were done with the saga of Donald Trump and Stormy Daniels, you would be mistaken. Because Stormy has lobbied the Ninth Circuit to revive her suit against the President of the United States.
Tim, there's been multiple suits, so we have to keep track of what suit this is. This is the libel suit that she filed against the President of the United States when he claimed she had said that she was assaulted, or threatened rather, in a parking lot about keeping quiet about a liaison with the President. The president tweeted and said it was a total con job and fake news. She sued him for libel, which is the claim that he said that she was a liar when she wasn't, basically, right? Mm-hmm. And his defense is this is a hyperbolic statement. It wasn't, it was a tweet, and it was the typical they're all crooked or something like that somebody might say about somebody. It's not like a formalized statement of her dishonesty.
Nothing Donald Trump ever says is formalized.
Well, yes. But in terms of the meaning of libel and slander, the reason why I bring this case to the table is not just because they're famous people who are in it, but because I think it has implications for the First Amendment. If you can't say, oh, they're a bunch of con men or something like that without that being free speech, well, watch out. And the people who will be most affected by that negatively will not be the President of the United States. It will be some kid in college who's tweeting, or posting on Facebook.
We are treading such new ground in all this. I mean, I was thinking the other day when the president called Bernie Sanders a communist, which is, used to be something that would immediately begin violence. I was just thinking that, well, I wonder, suppose Bernie said, I'm not a communist, I'm a socialist. In fact, I'm a democratic socialist, so I'll sue the president for libeling me by calling me a communist. Isn't that really along the same lines?
I think that's a little bit further down the road, but yeah, it's the idea that the courts should be deciding these things is ridiculous. And to the extent that Ms. Daniels suffered injury, I think would be a tough one to prove. She seems to have turned, much like Donald Trump, she seems to be a person for whom there seems to be no such thing as bad publicity.
Indeed, no such thing as bad publicity, only publicity.
Yeah.
Donald Trump made it to the White House on that, after all, Scott. Mm-hmm. Now, undercover cops hired 118 handymen down in Hillsborough County, Florida, then arrested them all for not having licenses.
Hillsborough County Sheriff Chad Chronister, Tim, is the law enforcement elected official who thought that the best use of the confiscated funds of the county residents taken from them against their will in terms of tax money, where would that best be used in a law enforcement capacity within the county, Tim? Well, to arrest a bunch of people who are trying to make their way in the world by fixing light bulbs and installing this and that for the various homeowners. It's a shocking story. So many people, both in terms of the residents and the people who are trying to make a buck by serving them are impacted negatively by this kind of a thing. And it's just one of these discriminations. The state of Florida has said, we're going to discriminate for you against anybody who doesn't have some kind of certificate that we issue. And people should be free, Tim, to work or not based on their own, assertions of their value. This isn't a case about fraud. We're not talking about people who've said, I'm a master tile layer with 40 years experience, and it turns out they have none. We're not talking about that. We're just talking about people who don't have the government certification to do that work.
This just strikes me as another iteration of the same argument about taxis versus Ubers. And Ubers shouldn't be allowed to exist because they're not licensed, because the state hasn't sanctioned them, and they have done that with taxi drivers. Isn't it really the same argument here?
It's totally the same argument. It has to do with this government permission concept and right. Also sort of rent seeking, where if you are a master plumber, there's a million things that a person with very little plumbing experience could do at a reduced rate that it would make sense for them to do. It's sort of like if you think about having a doctor apply a Band-Aid. That's not the best use of a doctor's time. But it's illegal for somebody else to say, come and get your Band-Aids applied here as a medical professional. You can't do that. Same thing for the plumbing.
Now, a shocking revelation that nobody could possibly believe, Scott. A speeding ticket racket revealed as a government and insurance scam. Say it ain't so.
Yeah, Tim, this is the Governor's Highway Safety Association in league with the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. And they give grants. They're offering hundreds of thousands of dollars for each speed management pilot project, which is basically a way to give you more tickets.
Oh, I love the language. Yeah. Speed management pilot project. Was that it? Oh, I love that. Love it.
And what happens is that the insurance companies make a lot of money by seeing that more speeding tickets are given, because then they can levy basically a tax on people's policies for speeding. And so they want to see more and more speeding tickets written. That's their goal. And so they commission these studies which indicate that there's a safety benefit from it, and then they get the grants, and then pretty soon that money, those hundreds of thousands of dollars, that's not a gift, Tim. That's an investment in their future income. That's why it was made. I mean, these insurance companies aren't charities, So, Tim, when the people see the headline in their local paper about how the department is proud to accept the grant from the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, they should realize that's a grant to take money from their pocket and give it to both the municipality and the insurance company.
Well, I kind of lied, Scott, about not talking about impeachment. I have to mention the word once here, because immediately after the impeachment acquittal, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell filed cloture on more judges to remake the judiciary. And that's the word, isn't it? Remaking the judiciary, because Trump has certainly done that.
Oh, yeah. So President Obama appointed 55 circuit judges in 8 years. So far, Trump has 50 in his 3 years in office. Okay.
Wow.
So that's the rate. And guess what? It's 5 judges that McConnell has teed up to go. I think it's this week or next. And guess what? The process has been streamlined. There would be some charade where the Democrats would try to block it, and then there would be some other move. But that would take a long time in terms of days or hours or weeks. But that has now been streamlined.
So it sounds like if Donald Trump gets a second term, Scott, that he would, by the time his 8 years are over, will have had a much larger impact on the judiciary writ large than Obama did in his 8 years.
Tim, I think that by the end of the second term, I'm going to be appointed a federal judge if that keeps up.
On that uplifting note, thank you, Scott.
Thanks.
This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcasts, The Uprising, hosted by Scott and The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, where past is prologue. All available on demand at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. So that is it for this week, but we will be back at you next week, same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying, stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.